In the early months of 1997, the city of Nashville, Tennessee was gripped with fear. For the first time in the Music City's storied history, citizens were faced with the reality that a serial killer was stalking their city. On the morning of February 16, 1997, two employees of a Captain D's restaurant were preparing to open for the day when a man knocked on the front door holding a job application. The restaurant manager, 25-year-old Steve Hampton, opened the door and let the man in. A moment later, the man produced a pistol and ordered the manager and another employee, 16-year-old Sarah Jackson, into the cooler, where he shot and killed them both. After emptying the safe of nearly $7,000 in small bills and coins and taking Steve Hampton's wallet, the killer left, locking the door behind him. The police arrived on the scene after another employee of Captain D's arrived for work and found the front door locked. Investigators discovered the bodies of the victims in the cooler. Each had been shot multiple times. The killer had left little evidence at the scene except some bloody shoe prints near the victims. The next day, Steve Hampton's wallet was discovered 11 miles away along a highway in East Nashville. Near the wallet was a movie rental card belonging to Hampton, with Hampton's fingerprints and a single latent thumbprint of an unknown individual. Witnesses that morning reported seeing a tall white male at the front door of the restaurant speaking to Steve Hampton shortly before the murders. One witness got a good enough look to help police sketch artists create a composite sketch of the man, now a suspect in the murders. 4 weeks later, on the evening of March 23rd, at a McDonald's restaurant only 3 miles away from the scene of the Captain D's murders, a man approached 4 employees as they were leaving at closing time. The man forced the employees back into the store and ordered them into the storeroom at the back of the restaurant. Once in the storeroom, the killer shot 17-year-old Andrea Brown, 27-year-old Ronald Santiago, and 23-year-old Robert Sewell to death, execution style. Realizing the killer had run out of ammunition, the fourth victim, 39-year-old Jose Gonzalez, jumped up and began to fight the assailant. The killer produced a knife and stabbed Gonzalez 17 times in the neck and upper torso. Thinking Gonzalez was dead, a mistake which would later seal his fate, the killer emptied the registers and safe of nearly $3,000 and fled the scene. Gonzalez, however, was not dead and managed to drag himself to a phone and call 911. Investigators began to believe that given the same MO as the murders a month before at Captain D's and the brutal violence of the murders at McDonald's, they were now dealing with not only the same killer, but also a killer whose motivation was no longer purely financial. 1 month to the day after the slayings at McDonald's, a man appeared at a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop in nearby Clarksville, Tennessee, 50 miles from Nashville, and persuaded the two employees, 21-year-old Angela Holmes and 16-year-old Michelle Mace, to let him inside. Once inside, the man abducted the two women at gunpoint, forced them into a car, and drove them to nearby Dunbar Cave State Park, a few miles away. The following morning, the two women's bodies were discovered, each with multiple stab wounds and their throats cut. One was cut so severely that she was nearly decapitated. Witnesses reported seeing a small red car near both the Baskin-Robbins and the state park where the victims were discovered. The break for investigators would come 6 weeks later on the evening of June the 1st, when the manager of a Nashville Shoney's restaurant was relaxing at home with his family when they heard a knock on the door. Mitch Roberts was stunned to see a former Shoney's short order cook, Paul Dennis Reid, whom Roberts had fired a few months earlier on February 15th after he threw a plate in the kitchen, striking another employee, the day before the murders at Captain D's. Walking out onto the porch, Reid began pleading with Roberts for his old job back and explained that he had evidence in his car, a small red Ford Escort, that would prove Roberts' employees were stealing from the restaurant. As they approached the car, Reid pulled a gun and ordered Roberts to get in. Roberts refused, turned, and walked back toward his front door. Reid followed Roberts to the front door, and at the last second, Roberts spun around and punched Reid in the chest. He used this distraction to get inside, lock the door, and call the police. Reid then fled in his vehicle. When police arrived, they were making a statement with Mitch Roberts when his phone rang. It was Paul Reid, wanting to patch things up. At the instruction of the police, Roberts agreed, and when Reid arrived, he was arrested on attempted kidnapping charges. Once in custody, investigators began to link Reid to the murders of the fast food restaurant employees. Reid matched the composite sketches of a man seen at the Captain D's restaurant the morning of the murders. Additionally, the latent thumbprint on Steve Hampton's movie rental card belonged to Paul Reid. The bloody shoe prints at the scene matched a pair of tennis shoes found in Reid's home containing DNA evidence of the two victims. Reid's home was only 3 miles from where Steve Hampton's wallet had been found along the highway. Investigators also found large jars filled with several $100s in loose coins in Reid's home. Paul Reid's red Ford Escort matched the description of a car that had been seen at the Baskin-Robbins restaurant in Clarksville, Tennessee, and at Dunbar Cave State Park, where the bodies of Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace were found. Reid had paid cash for the car in $20 bills a week after the murders at McDonald's. Additionally, forensic investigators found fibers on the victim's clothing that matched fiber samples taken from Reid's car. The most damning evidence against Paul Reid was the testimony of Jose Gonzalez, the sole survivor of the murders at the McDonald's restaurant. Gonzalez testified that it was Reid who had murdered the other 3 victims and who had stabbed and left him for dead on the floor of the restaurant. In May of 2000, Reid was convicted on 7 counts of capital murder and sentenced to die by lethal injection.
You have been found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder in counts 1, 2, and 3.
Paul Reid would unsuccessfully appeal his convictions many times over the next decade, citing everything from mental illness to improper prosecution, even divine intervention. But Reid would ultimately go on to die from complications resulting from pneumonia in 2013. Paul Dennis Reid was a man with a troubled past. Reid's mother was abandoned by his father when he was a toddler, and because his mother had drug and alcohol abuse problems, Paul Reid became a ward of the state at the age of 8. Reid was held back from starting school until he was almost 9 years old because he suffered from learning disorders and a lower than average IQ. As a teenager, Reid was charged as a juvenile with theft and assault, a pattern of behavior which would follow him into adulthood. In 1983, when Reid was 26, he was convicted of aggravated armed robbery of a restaurant in Houston, Texas. Paroled in 1990, he moved to Nashville, where he pursued a career as a country music singer. Doctors would later testify at his murder trials that his paranoid delusion caused him to harbor beliefs that he was part of a government mind control project, and that the government was using this sophisticated technology to surveil and control him. A criminal psychologist who interviewed Reid also testified that he had difficulty conceptualizing and understanding the severity of the charges laid against him. However, a clinical psychologist who testified on Reid's behalf noted that Reid had told him that he had joked about faking mental illness in the past, but was never actually ill. It is difficult to determine whether or not Paul Reid's childhood and alleged mental disorders could have been detected early enough in his life to potentially predict his eventually becoming a serial killer. Without a doubt, he was a troubled youth that seemingly could not break the cycle of criminal behavior that followed him wherever he went. This behavior increased in both frequency and violence until ultimately he committed murder. Given that his last crime was not simply a robbery, but an abduction and double murder, it is clear that his behavior had degraded to the point where he killed because he enjoyed the killing. Based on the evidence presented by the prosecution and by Reid's own actions, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Paul Reid committed the murders for which he was accused, and his conviction gave a sense of closure to the families that had been ripped apart by his actions.